Okay, who's ready? Yeah. All right, the purpose of this session is merely to paint a picture of the landscape that we find ourselves in as Christians living in the West in the year of our Lord 2023. Anything I'm about to say, you probably already know, at least intuitively. And unless you've been living under a rock or have been plugging your ears and closing your eyes for the past decade, you already know that we do not live in our grandmother's America anymore. Our culture has changed, and it has not changed for the better. Our society is like the self-deluded man who, without a parachute, jumps out of the back of the airplane and is very much enjoying the wind in his hair, and he even begins to believe that he has achieved the power of flight, but it is only a matter of time. Self-delusion is always short-lived, and the fast-approaching ground has a way of confirming that. So it's hard to miss that the social climate in which Christian ministry is conducted in the Western world has become more antagonistic towards the Christian faith. We live in a hostile world, an increasingly hostile world, hostile towards God, hostile towards His Bible, and hostile towards anyone silly enough to take God at His word and build their lives thereupon. Therefore, we have a question that we must ask and begin to answer. What has happened? Or, where have we been and where are we now? Or, what time is it? Is it time for Christians to lay back in the easy chair? Is it time for Christians to run for the hills? Or is it time for Christians to stand up and be counted, sword in one hand, trowel in the other, ready to fight and build? Indeed, I would call all of us to be like the sons of Issachar, men who came to the aid of King David when he was on the run from his enemies. The sons of Issachar, 1 Chronicles 12 says, were men who had understanding of the times to know what Israel ought to do. They knew what time it was. They were wise. They knew the climate of the culture in which they were living. And more than that, they knew what to do about it. And this is what I hope and pray for this Established Households event. I pray that together we may know the time in which we live and what we ought to do. That is why we picked the specific topics for each of the breakout sessions. We hope that they are timely, and we hope that they are practical, for we live in a negative world. In our society, abortion on demand has killed more than 60 million children, and those fortunate enough to survive are then at risk of being told that though they are a boy, they're actually a girl. And now we're going to chemically castrate you, cut off your perfectly healthy penis, pump you full of cross-sex hormones, put you in a dress, paint makeup on your face, and sell you out to the newest agenda, whereby we may virtue signal to the rest of the groomers around us how much more progressive and inclusive and loving we are compared to those dirty, nasty bigots we call Christians. But we are Christians, and we stand upon the great doctrines of the Reformation. We believe in a sovereign God who rules over every square inch of His creation. We believe in the only mediator between God and man, the Lord Jesus Christ. And we believe in the Holy Spirit who indwells and equips His people with gifts so that they might push back the darkness and fight for the day when the glory of God will cover the earth as the waters cover the sea. We seek to follow in the footsteps of John Calvin, Martin Luther, John Knox, Charles Spurgeon, J.C. Ryle, Amy Carmichael, Elizabeth Elliot, and all the faithful whose names have been lost to history. We believe along with them that our God is not just the God of heaven out there somewhere, but He is Lord of earth as well. He has created this place, and He knows best how to live in it. Our culture now hates that idea, and it's time for us Christians to wake up and realize the moment in which we live, for our God has not given us a spirit of fear, but of power and love and self-control. And so we must ask ourselves, do we know what time it is? And do we know what we ought to do? And to help us get a handle on our present moment, I'd like to draw our attention to an article written by Aaron Wren. Aaron is a Christian, and he is a cultural analyst who provides helpful insights on topics of society, cities, politics, economics, and the family. And last year, he wrote an article for First Things magazine entitled The Three Worlds of Evangelicalism. And this article has gained a lot of traction, and many have found it a worthwhile taxonomy or a way of understanding our present moment. And in a lot of ways, that article is what helped us frame this Established Households event. So he sketches a helpful picture or narrative of where we find ourselves today as Christians living in the West, and more specifically, living in America in 2023. So he writes, within the story of American secularization, so America turning more secular, there have been three distinct stages. The positive world, everything before 1994. Society at large retains a mostly positive view of Christianity. To be known as a good, church-going man remains part of being an upstanding citizen. Publicly being a Christian is a status enhancer. Christian moral norms are the basic moral norms of society, and violating them can bring negative consequences. And then we moved into neutral world. He frames this as 1994 to 2004. Society takes a neutral stance towards Christianity. Christianity no longer has privileged status, but is not disfavored. Being publicly known as a Christian has neither a positive nor a negative impact on one's social status. Christianity is a valid option within a pluralistic public square, and Christian moral norms retain some residual effect. And then we moved into the negative world, 2014 up to the present day, where society has come to have a negative view of Christianity. Being known as a Christian is a social negative, particularly in the elite domains of society. Christian morality is expressly repudiated and seen as a threat to the public good and the new public moral order. Subscribing to Christian moral views or violating the secular moral order brings negative consequences. So here's what he's saying, and what he's observing is this. Since the high watermark of church attendance in the 50s in America, Christianity's status within society has been fundamentally eroding. And as that erosion occurred, we went through two tipping points, which have divided that period into three eras or three worlds. So starting in the 60s, a period of decline from positive to neutral to negative world. And keep in mind, these refer to how society as a whole views Christianity. You know, we're often used to talking about how the church should relate to culture and how the church views society. You remember some of you might remember that famous book by Richard Niebuhr, Christ and Culture, where he lays out 6 different ways that the church relates to culture. This is the opposite of that. This is how culture views the church. So stay with me here. In the positive world, this is a world in which Christianity has a favored status on society as a whole. You know, you remember in 1954, Eisenhower, what did Eisenhower do? Oh, he added "under God" to the Pledge of Allegiance. And in 1956, Congress officially adopted "In God We Trust" onto our money. You had the high watermark, like I said, of church attendance. 50% of adults were semi-regularly attending church. We had prayer in public schools. And, maybe it wasn't especially a devout era, but there was a sort of institutionalization of like a soft Protestantism. Christianity was still held in high esteem and honor. And for the most part, he says, evangelicals responded to this positive world. So evangelicals, Christians living in this positive world, responded to it with 2 identifiable ministry strategies. And these strategies were the culture war and seeker sensitivity. And you've heard of these, maybe, and many of you lived through these. The culture war strategy, so this is how the church related to culture in this era of the positive world. The culture war strategy, also known as, he writes, as the religious right, is the best known movement of the positive world era. The very name of its leading organization, the Moral Majority, speaks to a world in which it was at least plausible to claim that Christians still represented the majority of the country. The religious right arose during the so-called New Right movement in the 70s, in part as a response to the sexual revolution and the moral deterioration of the country. So they started to feel the cracks in the foundation. They responded with culture war. They rallied politically and said, let's take back our country. The religious right culture warriors took a highly combative stance toward the emerging secular culture. By and large, the people we associate with the religious right today were those far away from the citadels of culture. Many were in backwater locations, so they weren't in cities, they were out in rural areas. They tended to use their own platforms, they used direct mail, paid for their own television shows, initially funded by just their small churches. So that's why, which led to, this attention-grabbing, market-driven style, which is very much carried on with the televangelists of our day. Major culture war figures include Jerry Falwell of Moral Majority, Pat Robertson of the Christian Broadcasting Network, James Dobson, Focus on the Family, Ralph Reed of Christian Coalition, televangelist Jimmy Swaggart, and Jim and Tammy Faye Baker. Now, a second strategy of the positive world movement was seeker sensitivity. And this was likewise pioneered in the 70s in suburban megachurches. So you might remember Bill Hybels or Rick Warren out in California, Bill Hybels in Chicago. The very term seeker sensitive shows that it was predicated on an underlying friendliness to Christianity. It's a model that assumes that large numbers of people are actively seeking. If you remember the story of Bill Hybels when he arrived in Chicago and he wanted to start a church, he went door to door, thousands of people's houses. He went door to door knocking and he'd ask them one question. He said, "Do you go to church?" And if they said, "Yep," then the conversation was over. But if they said no, then he would say, "Why don't you?" And they would give him all kinds of reasons. And he would write down all those reasons, collate them. And then he's surveying all these unchurched people about why they didn't attend. And they decided to design a church that would appeal to them stylistically. And he was able to get a large number to come through their doors. Rick Warren did the same thing out in Southern California. Seeker-sensitive churches downplayed or eliminated denominational affiliations, distinctives, traditions. They adopted informal liturgies, contemporary music. Seeker sensitivity operated in a therapeutic register, sometimes explicitly. They were approachable, non-threatening. Today, there are many large suburban megachurches of this general type in the United States, which to some extent represent the evangelical mainstream. So we had positive world, where society at large had a very positive view of Christianity, and Christians in that world responded with the culture war and with seeker sensitivity. But then eventually in 1994, that's the watershed moment that Aaron Renn marks it at, and he does that because it was like the moment of like a lot of the urban renewal, people moving back to the cities and the rejuvenation of cities. Many, especially highly educated people, moved into the cities. He also says you can mark it at like the falling of the Berlin Wall, 1989. That was a watershed moment, and Christianity very much at that time was used as kind of like a moral freight to like argue a fight against communism. But then once the wall fell, proverbially, like we didn't have any more use of Christianity so much, so it kind of fell into disrepute, more of a neutral world. Wherever you mark it, it's not as important. But the neutral world is the time when society at large takes a more neutral stance towards Christianity. You know, it doesn't hold the same sway and influence as positive world, but it is also not yet seen as a threat. It's viewed as just one nice option among many. You can have your Rotary Club or your local book club. You can be part of the Baptist Church, Presbyterian, Episcopal Church. You can be a member of the golf course or any number of social clubs. It's all kind of seen as the same thing. And he says that in neutral world, by contrast, the characteristic evangelical strategy, so the way Christians responded in neutral world, was with what he calls cultural engagement. The neutral world cultural engagers were in many ways the opposite of like the culture warriors. Rather than fighting against culture, they were explicitly positive toward it. They didn't denounce secular culture, but they confidently engaged that culture on its own terms in a pluralistic public square. They believed that Christianity could still be articulated in a compelling way and had something to offer that environment. And in this quest, they wanted to present in the secular elite media and forums, not just on their own platforms. The leading lights of the cultural engagement strategy were much more urban, frequently based in major global cities or college towns. The neutral world emerged concurrently with the resurgence of America's urban centers, so our cities. The flow of college-educated Christians into these urban centers created a different kind of evangelical social base, one shaped by urban cultural sensibilities rather than rural or suburban ones. And so these evangelicals tended to downplay like flashpoint social issues such as abortion or homosexuality, and instead they emphasized the gospel, often in a therapeutic way, and priorities like helping the poor and select forms of social activism. And in essence, the cultural engagement strategy is an evangelicalism that takes its cues from the secular elite consensus. Sometimes they attracted secular elites or sub-elites to their churches. Most of the urban church world and many parachurch organizations embraced the cultural engagement strategy, and sub-suburban megachurches have shifted in that direction as well. So major figures that did this, groups like Tim Keller of Redeemer Presbyterian in New York City, Hillsong Church in New York City and Los Angeles, Christianity Today, Chicago, Veritas Forum in Boston, Senator Ben Sass in Washington, D.C., contemporary artist Makoto Fujimura in New York City, and author Andy Crouch in Philadelphia, if you know any of those names. But eventually, the neutral world, according to Aaron Renn, gives way to the negative world and a cultural climate that is hostile to the Christian faith. And he places this transition from the neutral to the negative world in the year 2014. This being the year right before the watershed moment of the Obergefell decision, if you remember what that is. The negative world, 2014, gives us the Obergefell decision. In 2015, the first time in 400 years of life in American Christianity is viewed negatively. So it's these things like 2015, the Obergefell decision, which legalized gay marriage in all 50 states and included a dignitary harm clause, which changed the legal definition of harm to a failure to affirm a person's LGBTQ plus dignity, which explains why so many teachers began losing their jobs and people their small businesses. And then in 2020, we had the Bostock decision, which furthered Obergefell and inserted the LGBTQ plus persons under the 1964 Civil Rights Act, granting them all the same legal rights and protections. And then in 2021, we had anti-bullying legislation, which was a federal mandate in every public school in the U.S., a federal mandate to teach LGBTQ plus advocacy as anti-bullying curriculum, something you cannot exempt your child from. And thus, we find ourselves today in what Aaron Renn calls the negative world. Society at large has a largely negative view of Christianity. Now, sorry if that was a lot. We don't normally take that much time on sociological analysis. But let me summarize everything he just said with two illustrations. First, okay, we move from positive, neutral to negative world, and I think we all kind of intuitively know this. But let me illustrate it with let me give you two illustrations that show this. The first one is with 3 sex scandals, okay? Roll back the time to 1987, when then Colorado Senator Gary Hart is the leading candidate for the Democratic nomination for president. And the Miami Herald reports that a young woman had stayed overnight at his townhouse in D.C., and Gary Hart was forced to withdraw from the race just because of the appearance of a potential affair. Okay, 1987, more positive world. Neutral world, 1998, you remember this? The Drudge Report drops the big news that Bill Clinton and Monica Lewinsky have been having an affair in the White House, a sitting president. Okay, big scandal. Maybe cost Al Gore the 2000 presidency. But nevertheless, Democrats rally around Bill Clinton. It damages him, but he survives it. And the rationale is, look, his personal behavior, however deplorable, is not relevant to his performance in office. And he retains it. Very neutral world response. Then in 2016, in October, several weeks before the election, that famous election, NBC News is sitting on that Access Hollywood tape, and they can't wait to drop this bombshell to take down Trump. And they drop it. You remember that tape of him talking to, I don't remember that guy's name, on the bus. A lot of what they call locker room talk, very inappropriate. They're very derogatory towards women. They drop that bombshell tape, and it turns out to be what? A 48-hour blip on the radar, 48-hour scandal, and he goes on to win the election 2 weeks later. Now, second illustration, okay? Let's illustrate this by the last 3 Democratic presidents and their changing view on gay marriage, okay? So 1996, the very tail end of what Aaron Renn calls positive world. Tail end of positive world, 1996, Bill Clinton signed the Defense of Marriage Act into law, expressing his, quote, long-standing belief that marriage is an institution for the union of a man and a woman, okay? As a Democratic president, 2008, we have Obama running for his first term in the midst of neutral world. Barack Obama campaigned on his personal belief in traditional marriage. He says repeatedly that he's against gay marriage, and he says famously in an interview with Rick Warren out at Saddleback, quote, I believe that marriage is the union between a man and a woman. Now, for me as a Christian, it is also a sacred union. God is in the mix. That's what he tells to Rick Warren in an interview when he's campaigning. Then he gets into office, and he resisted any further attempt to protect that institution. You know, famously in 2011, his Department of Justice stopped defending the Defense of Marriage Act that Bill Clinton had put in place in the courts. They didn't actively promote any kind of agenda, but they just took their hands off and stopped defending it. He campaigned for traditional marriage, famously said it in an interview with Rick Warren, but then when in office, we're not going to defend that anymore. So it's a perfect kind of neutral world response. But then in 2020, in the throes, very much the throes of negative world, we have President Joe Biden unapologetically embraces a rejection of traditional marriage as defined by the exclusive union of one man and one woman. And he has thrown out the objective, rational, moral standard of God's law that is known by all people and has instead sought to enshrine the chaos and confusion of negative world. And the enshrinement of this redefinition of marriage into law has released chaos into the body politic, and Christians now find themselves increasingly alienated from a society that is unmoored from God and his law. Now, the marks of the negative world are many. Aside from abortion and the LGBTQ plus agenda, we have drag queen story hour, critical race theory, Black Lives Matter, intersectionality, godless social justice activism, aggressive censorship, woke ideology, a proliferation of pornography, rising crime, senseless violence, and a myriad of other social ills. So now we're not going to go any more into Ren's article. We can leave it here, but I'd love to commend it to you for further reading, so you can understand more about how he fleshes out some of this dramatic shift that we've been living through. The Three Worlds of Evangelicalism by Aaron Renn in First Things magazine. And again, we briefly cover all of this because we want to be like the sons of Issachar, men who had understanding of the times and knew what they ought to do. It doesn't do anybody any good to stick their head in the sand. We can ignore what's going on around us, but that leaves us naive at best and complicit at worst. And many within the church have bought the lies and are playing it safe. Many people, many leaders, those who are supposed to be shepherds are opening the door, and the negative world is infiltrating the church. Pastor Chris touched on that a couple weeks ago when he preached on Matthew 7:15 through 20 on false teachers. These lies are destroying the church, mutilating young people, perverting the minds and lives of countless image bearers of God. Now, if you've been tracking here and staying awake and you've been thinking about this, the thought might have occurred to you, hasn't Christianity always been in the negative world? Isn't that kind of the norm for Christians? I mean, Jesus said the world would hate us. And you will be hated by all for my name's sake, but the one who endures to the end will be saved. Mark 13:13. Do not be surprised, brothers, that the world hates you. 1 John 3:13. I have given them your word, and the world has hated them because they are not of the world, just as I am not of the world. John 17:14. Indeed, all who desire to live a godly life in Christ Jesus will be persecuted. 2 Timothy 3:12. Indeed, a fallen world that loves the darkness will always hate the light of Christ. Christians have lived in a negative world hundreds of times over. You cannot open a history book without encountering that fact. But consider this observation from Dr. Joe Rigney. What marks out Western society today as unique is that it has rejected completely the objective, rational, moral order that is embedded in the cosmos. We call this God's natural law. It is the universal, normative, natural, baked into creation moral structure of the world that human beings have always acknowledged. Read Romans chapter 1, for instance. Let's use just one example. All cultures throughout history around the globe have known that a boy who is born a boy will stay a boy. A girl who is born a girl will stay a girl. And any exception merely proves the rule. But our culture no longer wants to acknowledge this. Instead, we want to believe that reality is not fixed and ordered by God. Rather, reality is more like Play-Doh. It's infinitely malleable. We can mold reality whatever way we want. It's not that I must conform myself to fit the moral structure of the universe out there. Rather, it's that the universe out there must conform itself to how I feel in here. My feelings, my emotions are what dictate reality. Reality is like Play-Doh, and I can mold reality to fit my feelings and emotions. My feelings dictate what is true. Now, rebellion against that design, the way God has designed this world, is possible and can be temporarily effective. Stress the word temporarily. In other words, it's real, it's there, and you can rebel against it, and you can be temporarily effective. But just like we mentioned before, the man who is self-deceived, or better yet, a society that's self-deceived, may jump out of an airplane and enjoy the wind in their hair, and they may even start to believe that they have the ability of flight, but it's only a matter of time. Or to make a more biblical analogy, the prodigal can have some fun for a little while, but eventually the checks bounce. The prodigal runs out of money, and he must either die in the pig pen or come home in repentance. And here is our transition to the last part of this session as we try and land this plane. I don't know what you think about Aaron's Wren concept of the three worlds, positive, neutral, negative. I don't know if you agree or disagree, or if you like some other version of that. Regardless, I do know that most of you, if not all of us, deep down in our bones know that we're living in a unique negative world. We can feel what time it is, and a fundamental shift has taken place at the social level, and Christians are left grappling for what to do about it. In the positive and neutral worlds, Christians responded with ministry strategies, and remember that Wren calls the culture war, seeker sensitivity, and cultural engagement. But he doesn't think that Christians, himself included, have come up with an approach that's appropriate for these times. No strategy, he says, has yet developed for the negative world. Now, one strategy has been proposed in a book back in 2018 called The Benedict Option, taken from a title of a book by Rod Dreher. The Benedict Option happens when a group of believers pull back from society at large and put their focus on developing and maintaining their own Christian community. Much like its namesake, St. Benedict, or the Benedictine monks in the monastery, we pull out of culture. It's more of like a strategic retreat. The world's going to do what the world's going to do. Let's just pull back, focus internally, and ride this thing out. And this proposal was not received well initially. People thought it was alarmist. Rod Dreher is also an Eastern Orthodox, so it was hard for him to appeal to evangelicals. And he also framed it and gave it a name of a Catholic saint, which wasn't very accessible on the surface for evangelicals. But as of late, some have reconsidered his proposals. But what I would like to put forward as we close is another option. This is not unique to me, but this is in line with what we're trying to do here tonight and tomorrow and in this Christian ministry that we call Celebration Community Church. Let's call this option the Boniface option. Let me tell you a story. The story begins in a time long before the establishment of Christianity in the Germanic lands where a massive oak grew. 700s. In the 700s. It was a true giant of trees. So tall, this is a true story. So tall, its topmost branches were hidden by clouds. Its ancient body was broad and was twisted, from which a profusion of long, gnarled, stretching limbs spread, creating a vast, overarching canopy of darkness centered around the tree. To the people of these lands, the great tree was sacred, and it was venerated as the thunder oak of their great god Thor, and one of the most important shrines of his cult. Yet under the darkness of its great canopy, human victims died under the bloodied knife of the priests of Thor, their blood soaking into the ground to feed the ravenous roots of this ancient oak. Even in the dead of winter, bare of leaves and acorns, the space under its vast spreading branches, clumped with mistletoe, was a place of continuous and gloomy darkness. In this dreaded place, an atmosphere of quiet but overwhelming fear pervaded under the great smothering branches. Animals avoided this tree, making wide detours around it, while birds would not fly near or over it or perch in its branches. Even buzzing flies and creeping insects kept well out of the dreaded darkness under its canopy. Over the great tree rose a bright moon. The high priest chanted and made magical signs over the altar, while this victim lay shivering in the cold, awaiting the stab of pain from the deadly knife that would end their life. As the high priest spread his arms out towards the great thundering oak, his eyes adoring the sacred tree, his hands raised to strike, the air became still, all sound in the forest stopped, and silence fell. The bright moon rose to its zenith, sending her rays to find and illuminate the helpless man, spread eagle on the altar slab, awaiting the stab of pain that would end his life. But it never came. Instead, something extraordinary happened. As the pure rays of the brilliant moon lit the altar, the forest's silence was broken. From the depths of the woods came the sound of Christian hymns sung by a throng of people, growing louder as they drew nearer. They were led by St. Boniface, who had come to their land to bring Christianity and establish the Church of Jesus Christ. As the illuminating moon banished the darkness under the great thunder tree of Thor, St. Boniface strode forward, wielding a shiny axe. The high priest, dagger in his hand, his raised arms poised to strike, he froze. His followers parted to allow the saint to march directly up to the thunder oak, unchallenged. And then, gathering his strength in his arms, he struck a blow that caused a great gash in the tree's trunk with his axe. The shocked high priest and his followers looked on in fear as he struck the oak repeatedly, causing an ever-widening gash in its body. The crowd stepped back, fearing that at any moment Thor would send his lightning to strike this brazen man who dared defy their pagan god. But no such lightning bolt came, hacking away. And suddenly there was a loud crack, the tree split in two, and it fell to the ground with a thunderous crash. The Germans were astounded, and many immediately converted to Christianity and were baptized. And thus the gospel was planted in Germany, and the gates of hell have not been able to stop it. St. Boniface is a great model for courage and trust in God, to live radical lives for Christ. Although not all of us may be called to chop down a pagan tree for our faith, we're still called to live and proclaim Jesus' message. After all, St. Boniface can venture into a pagan, human-sacrificing village, chop down the inhabitants' most prized possession. Why can't we stand for Christ in our everyday lives? Now, if you don't like that and think, that doesn't seem very Christ-like, let me give you another story real quick from the Bible. The story of Gideon. If you remember the story of Gideon, they're living in the land of Israel. They did not obey the Lord initially when they moved into the land and drive out all the inhabitants like God told them to. So instead, they kept some of them around, and those people and those tribes ended up oppressing the people of Israel over the generations. And so when the story of Gideon comes in, you find Gideon hiding in a wine press because the Midianites have been oppressing his people. And the Lord comes to him as an angel and approaches him and calls him to do something great for him. And Gideon does not recognize him at first, but the angel comes home with Gideon, and eventually he recognizes him. And then he says this: that night the Lord said to Gideon, take your father's bull and the second bull, 7 years old. Pull down the altar of Baal that your father has. Cut down the Asherah that is beside it. Build an altar to the Lord your God on top of the stronghold here with stones laid in due order. Then take the second bull and offer it as a burnt offering with the wood of the Asherah that you shall cut down. So Gideon took 10 men of his servants and did as the Lord had told him. But because he was too afraid of his family and the men of the town to do it by day, he did it by night. And when the men of the town rose early in the morning, behold, the altar of Baal was broken down, and the Asherah beside it was cut down, and the second bull was offered on the altar that had been built. And they said to one another, who's done this thing? And after they had searched and inquired, they said, Gideon, the son of Joash, has done this thing. And then the men of the town said to Joash, hey, bring out your son that he may die, for he's broken down the altar of Baal and cut down the Asherah beside it. But Joash said to all who stood against him, will you contend for Baal? Will you save him? Whoever contends for him shall be put to death by morning. If he's a god, let him contend for himself, because his altar's been broken down. Therefore, on that day, Gideon was called Jerubbaal. That is to say, let Baal contend against him, because he has broken down his altar. This is the Boniface option. Now, let me offer us something towards a solution. Living in this negative world that we are. Quickly. The first thing, there's going to be 7. We'll go through these quickly. Trying to work towards a solution, trying to work out this thing that I like to call the Boniface option, where you roll up into a culture and you're confident in the Lord and you're not afraid, come what may, and you can chop down the idols of that culture. All of us have a role to play. It looks differently for all of us, but number 1, it starts with this. We have to think locally. In other words, think in concentric circles. I'm not charging out, I'm going to take the world for Christ and go save everyone around the world. No, I'm going to start with myself, right? This is the principle of take the speck out of your own eye before you can take the log out of someone else's. It's not saying that no one else has anything wrong. It says, but get your own house in order first, right? What's the qualifications for elders? That they have their own household in order. Before they can start leading and ruling in the church, they got to have their own junk together. And if they don't, who are they to tell someone to go change the world? Right? This is part of what someone like Jordan Peterson gets right when he says, you want to go change the world? Why don't you start by making your bed? Right? If you're a kid, if you're a young guy, and you got all this zeal and passion, you want to go change the world, but you can't get out of your mom's basement or hold a part-time job or make your own bed, who the heck are you to go tell everyone how to change the world? So you start with yourself. Start with yourself and getting your own self right with the Lord, and then we work out from there. We work out from our families. That's what we're trying to do here with our established households. We think that is the vital building block of fighting back against a culture like this. We're not just fighting, we're building, and we're trying to provoke this world to jealousy. That they see what's going on here, man, I want some of that. Because we're establishing our households in the Lord. Okay, so we have to think locally, think concentric circles. So ourselves, our family, our church, our school, our business, our government, our nation, out from there. What are the good works that the Lord has prepared in advance for me to do today? Well, I take responsibility for that. Okay, number 2, along that same line, we have to be proactive in our thinking. Proactive. So we have to think locally, and we have to be proactive. Okay? Nothing is neutral. It's either Christ or chaos. It's either for Christ or it's against Christ. There's no neutral ground in which we can all kind of come together in our pluralistic public square and discuss things. No, things are either for Christ or against them. Nothing's neutral in this world. We no longer have the luxury of not engaging on these issues. Whether this is done at home with our children or there in the public square, Christians can no longer be under the delusion that they may remain passive when it comes to living as a faithful Christ follower in this day and age. We no longer have the luxury in the negative world to coast in autopilot mode, refusing to engage. And this will look different for each of us in our different spheres. We will be discipled in all areas of society. We are being discipled. The issue is not whether we will be discipled in a certain issue. The issue is how we will be discipled in that area. Who is doing the discipling? Will it be the Word of God or will it be the culture? We must be proactive for ourselves, for our children, for our church. And our church here must remain on guard and fight the good fight of faith too. But that brings me to the third thing, which is confidence. I want you to have confidence. I want you to be so familiar with God and who He is and His character and His word that you have a joyful swagger about your life. Not arrogance, not pride, but confidence in who God and what God said. Jesus Christ is Lord. And the Great Commission is not go and make disciples of all nations. The Great Commission is therefore go and make disciples of all nations. And what comes before that? All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to Christ. Therefore, go and make disciples of all nations. Jesus Christ is Lord of all. The gospel is about more than just my personal salvation. It's about Christ taking dominion. reordering the cosmos through households, making disciples, restoring a cursed earth, building a Christian culture. If we're going to stand for Christ in a culture like ours, we will be challenging the natural man in the citadel of his being. Everything is at stake. Know who your God is. Know what he's promised to his people. And walk in the confidence of knowing his sovereign hand has determined all of your days, and not a hair can fall from your head apart from his sovereign decree. You are untouchable until God calls you home. Number 4 is courage. Though thinking biblically is becoming more socially unacceptable, and the contrast between the church and the world is increasing, and though not every Christian engaged in the war is engaged in the war at the same level, yet we all have some part to play in home, church, business, public square. Have confidence in what God has promised and take courage. Consider those who've gone before us and imitate their faith. Consider Abraham or Moses or Gideon, or consider Elijah on the top of Mount Carmel. Just him against the 450 prophets of Baal having a showdown of whose God is best, right? Or think of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego being the only ones standing when the trumpets blast and everyone is commanded by King Nebuchadnezzar to bow down to this statue. And they're standing they're in exile, away from their homeland, away from their people, living in Babylon, which at the time was the greatest kingdom this world has ever known. And they stood, come what may. Or Daniel, or Esther, or Stephen, or Peter. Be courageous and tell the truth in the public square that Jesus is king and all of you are accountable to him. And it is Jesus, not the governor or the county health department, who will save you. Your 401k cannot save you. Your wokeness cannot save you. A mask and a shot can not make you a good person. Facebook without works is dead. Reposting a meme is not the same thing as tangibly loving your literal neighbor. And if you are courageous, you will need to cultivate the virtue of tough-mindedness, for you will indeed encounter opposition. Think of the letter of 2 Timothy and consider how physically and mentally tough the Apostle Paul was, the mental and emotional toughness and resiliency that he had. For there's no avoiding conflict today, and this will be a characteristic of the negative world going forward. Conflict avoidance is impossible. There may be more conflict, stress, strain. As George Barna has surveyed, the exodus of clergy and pastors quitting is at an all-time high, and this has practical implications, but we must be ready for the stress and conflict and know the times and what to do. But great societies and churches were not built by emotional cupcakes with participation trophies sprinkled on top. So let us be resilient and tough-minded Christians who can take care of the responsibilities God has set before us. He has promised to never leave us or forsake us. He has promised to give us everything we need for life and godliness. But this, of course, needs to be tempered with wisdom. Do we know what time it is? But in Jesus are hidden all the treasures of wisdom and knowledge. And we want to press that lordship of Christ into every area of life. That's what we're going to try and do in the breakout sessions, with our marriages, in our workplace, with social media, with our identity and sexuality, with dating, and with the discipline of our children. We want to live within God's created order because reality is not Play-Doh. Everything relates to him. He made the world a certain way. And that's what we intend to do in these breakout sessions, to press the lordship of Christ into these contested areas of culture. And it takes wisdom. So, for example, it takes wisdom, and I mentioned it a few times here, the LGBTQ plus agenda. That's because it's such a hot button issue and it's so aggressive right now. But it takes wisdom to know the difference between victims of that agenda and the perpetrators of that. And we don't treat them the same way. So if you have young teenagers who've been sucked into this agenda, we don't treat them the same way as the teachers or the politicians or the doctors or the wicked parents who are pushing that down their throats. and confusing them. We treat them very differently. Not like the medical analog to a girl who has this kind of gender anxiety and thinks that she's supposed to be a boy. The medical analog to that would be like a girl with anorexia. We don't bash her. We don't bully her. Christians don't throw people away. But we also don't give her a sticker and put her at the front of a parade and then dedicate an entire month to celebrating her anorexia. Do we have to know the difference between, we don't treat her that way. We have compassion. But the perpetrators of that, you treat them in a very, very different, more aggressive way. And this takes wisdom. It takes wisdom to read the Word of God, understand it, and then apply that Word to our time and place. And may God continue to grant us that wisdom. And then finally, hospitality. 3 verses. Hebrews 13:2. Don't neglect to show hospitality to strangers, for thereby some have entertained angels. Philippians 2. Do all things without grumbling or disputing, that you may be blameless and innocent children of God without blemish in the midst of a crooked, twisted generation, among whom you shine as lights in the world. 1 Peter 4:9. Show hospitality to one another without grumbling. And we're going to talk more about hospitality in January after Christmas. But consider that 1 Peter 4:9, show hospitality to one another without grumbling. That verse comes one verse before Peter launches into a long explanation of what it means to suffer righteously and faithfully as a Christian. And he says, show hospitality to one another because you're going to suffer greatly. 7 things. Think locally in concentric circles. Be proactive in your thinking. Have confidence. Have courage. Be tough-minded. Have wisdom. And show hospitality. Now, as we're closing, how is this, how is this any different from a movement like some of you may have lived through or grown up in, from like a Bill Gothard kind of movement back in the 80s? You remember Bill Gothard and his movement, which was very much a scare tactic, kind of rile the people up and get them really worried about how terrible the culture is out there, and so listen to me, and I'll give you the solution. And I would say that this is different than that, because Bill Gothard and his ilk were very heavy-handed, they were very legalistic, and they were very joyless. And when you rile people up and get them scared enough and anxious enough, especially in the church, we can get really desperate. And when we get really desperate, we can get really grabby. And then we can look for the quickest solution that we can find. And I think that's why someone like a Bill Gothard was able to prey upon people in the church back in the 80s. And that's why this is so different, because we're not talking about microwaved results. We're not talking about quick solutions. We're talking about a long obedience. We're talking about cultivating something like a farmer or a gardener. The Boniface option, if we're going to call it that, cutting down idols. What do you do when the field then is cleared and is empty? You got to cultivate. You have to plant seeds. You got to put your hand to the plow and do the sweaty work of breaking up the hard soil. We're aiming at the transformation of hearts. That doesn't happen overnight. The story of St. Boniface goes on to say that he chopped down Thor's oak, and the wood from that tree he used to build the first church in the land that we now call Germany. I believe in this church. I believe in what we're trying to build here. I trust our elders. I'm thankful for each one of you. I'm encouraged that when we put on an event like this together, and there's a hunger for it, evidenced by you showing up here tonight, I'm encouraged that you desire to follow Christ and be numbered among his people in a hostile world. So what an opportunity that we have to live here and now. God is not surprised. In his wisdom and providence, he has put us and equipped us for this moment in history. So what do we have to be worried about? What's the worst they could do to us? You say they could kill us. Very well. We serve a king who rose from the dead. He knows the way out of the grave. We have nothing to fear. The kingdoms of this world will become the kingdoms of our God and of our Christ, and he shall reign forever and ever, world without end. We've read the end of the story. Let's get to work, huh?